All right. It is undeniable. Undeniably true. Even CNN has to confess it. What Trump has achieved with the EU is nothing short of remarkable. Even Jeff Zeleny, we played this earlier. Let me let you in on it again in case you weren't with us earlier. 3110 here. Here's CNN even having to confess what Trump has pulled off here with the EU is nothing short of a masterstroke.
Isabel, the bottom line is this is the biggest trade deal in President Trump's effort to effectively reshape the global trading order. That has been one of his central priorities since taking office in January. He's been issuing many threats of tariffs, but they clearly have been working in terms of bringing other countries, allies and adversaries alike, in some cases, to the negotiating table. And the latest example was today here in Scotland when the leader of the European Commission, who of course is negotiating for the European Union, she agreed to a 15% across-the-board tariff. Now that is significantly higher than the 10% tariffs in existence now, but it's much lower than the 30% threat that was coming on Friday, and the 50% threat that was.
Yeah, and bigger if they didn't come to the table. And she originally, the head of the EU, said she wasn't going to be rushed into this. She wasn't going to be bullied into this or what have you. And then all of a sudden she's there smiling and shaking hands and agreeing to 15%. So what's it all mean? What's it mean for you? What's the significance of this? Gentleman who knows this well because he comes from this space. He's a former advisor to the British Trade Secretary and a former advisor to the United States Trade Representative. His name is Shanker Singham. He's now the CEO of a company called Competary. And Mr. Singham, glad to make your acquaintance. Welcome to the show, sir.
Well, very good to meet with you, Chris, and good to be here.
So I would love for you, I guess you're native of the UK, is that right?
Yep, live both in the UK and in Virginia here. So
could you speak then to the significance of this as it relates maybe to the UK and to the EU? Because I know the UK has also done a trade deal, and they've actually come in at a lower rate than maybe Japan and the EU broadly because they're a smaller economy. But how do you read this through the European lens right now?
Yeah, so I think what to the sort of the CNN interview you just played. I mean, what we're seeing from the Trump administration is a comprehensive realignment of the sort of global trading picture, and essentially what the president is doing is he is saying to countries like the EU and Japan, and to the extent the UK has copied European regulation, the UK as well, Korea, India, others, is that look, for the last 30 years. You have distorted your markets, you've damaged US exporters, you've damaged US interests, and while your tariffs are not necessarily the problem, your other barriers are very much the problem, and you've done nothing about those. In fact, you've increased them. So if you look at the book he waved around on Liberation Day, which was the National Trade Estimate Inventory of Foreign Country Trade Barriers, those entries of different countries have gotten progressively bigger and bigger and bigger over the last 30 years. And what he's essentially saying is, look, you know, that game is now over. We're going to charge a tariff to take into account all of your unfair trade practices and so forth. And then we're going to have a discussion about how you lower this tariff based on your ability to basically make progress on reducing all of those barriers and distortions. And that's essentially what's happened here. The UK agreed to do some of those things. The EU has agreed to do some of those things. There's an ongoing conversation about many of the issues that American companies have sort of cared about for the last, as I say, 20 or 30 years. And we've never seen anything like this before in the international trading system, you know, going back to 1947. So, you know, it's a needed corrective in my view.
Could I ask you about that? Shanker Singham again with us, former advisor to the British Trade Secretary, former advisor to the United States Trade Representative as well. Why haven't we? I've always been curious about this. Republican and Democrat alike, former presidents have not been interested in renegotiating any of this. Trump has. What is it? Just inertia, laziness? Why has the United States never been interested in having a discussion about this before now?
Yeah, I think it's a number of things. I think first of all, there's a lack of understanding of how damaging these sorts of things actually are. There's sort of assumption because the tariff is a number, right? You see the number; it's very obvious that you know that's a particular problem. Back in 1947, when we started negotiating tariff reductions after the Second World War, they were very high. I mean, the tariffs across the world were very very, very high. As the tariffs came down, all of these other things started to become much, much more significant. And our economic modeling suggests that if you think of this as an iceberg, the tariff that other countries have on the US is about 20% of the iceberg. It's the bit above the water that you see. But below the water is 80% of the iceberg. And that's these kinds of issues, these kinds of unfair trade practices and so forth. And obviously there are countries like Japan and Korea and now China that are, absolutely masterful proponents of distorting their markets for trade advantage. So I think it's a combination of a lack of understanding of the effect, and I think it's also a lack of imagination. I think the thought was that we could just ask them to lower their barriers in these areas. We could, sort of invite them to do it. And unfortunately, there are a lot of powerful interests in these countries that benefit enormously from these barriers, and they're not going to roll over because you ask. And what the president has done is he said, okay, I'm not going to ask anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make your access to the US economy contingent on you reducing these kinds of things. And it seems to be working. Could I ask you,
Mr. Singham, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You said it seems to be working. It does seem to be working. And the question is that I hear, the left, it's so funny all of a sudden, the left, they've become very interested in the economy and what people are paying for things. And they say, well, this is just going to be passed on to the consumer. And Chuck Schumer was on the floor of the Senate. This is just going to make things more expensive for the American consumer. Why do you believe that's not true? Why has that not happened so far, and why do you believe that's not true? Now, they will point to certain things made in certain places that have gotten more costly. I'm not saying nothing's gotten more expensive, but on balance, it hasn't across the economy. And do you think companies are going to start ratcheting up costs and prices to Americans because of this?
Yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, what happens when you increase the tariff, as the president has done, is the importer generally will pay that tariff to the US government. So this is the argument they're making, that because of this it all gets passed on to the consumer. But the price that companies charge to the consumer depends on how much competition there is in the market. So if you are a very competitive market, then a lot of this price won't be charged. I mean, it's the importer who will pay, and the importer may start looking for alternative sources of supply if the one that they have becomes very expensive. So ultimately it's bad for the exporter because they're going to lose that source of distribution, but the consumer doesn't pay an additional amount. That only happens if your market is very uncompetitive and there's really only one source of supply.
Oh, this is so smart. And this is what Trump knows. He knows that in order to bring industry back home and make us more competitive with the globe, prices aren't going to be passed on to Americans. If Americans can compete and make the thing too, you're sort of at a standoff, if you will, right?
And the other point, of course, is the other bit that doesn't get fully covered is at the same time as doing all the tariffs, the president has also said he wants to reduce anti-competitive regulations in the US market. Now, that will have a much bigger effect on making things more efficient, on lowering price. So you've got, yes, a little bit of tariff pressure for prices to go up, but you've got a lot of regulatory reform in the US which will cause prices to come down. And certainly if you have, a Walmart, for example, which is a very powerful buyer, they're not going to eat the cost of the tariff, and they're not going to pass that on to their consumers. They're going to make the exporter pay for that. So it depends on what the market actually looks like. And I think what we're seeing, there may be some slight inflationary pressure as a result of the tariff. I think it's offset by a lot of these regulatory things that we are able to do. But compared to the gain that you get from actually causing other countries to lower their distortions. Remember, when President Trump came in, he came in largely because there were lots of people who had lost their jobs in steel mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio and places like this because of China distortions, because China had distorted its market and overproduced steel as a result and caused these steel companies to go out of business. So the gain you get from actually correcting all of that is massive, so I think, if this can succeed in lowering those distortions, you can get deals locked in by the US, you can improve the US's regulatory environment, then, he's talked about a golden age. I think you could have a golden age, not just in the US, but actually elsewhere.
One of the big deals with the EU was them buying more of our energy. We're producing a ton of it. We can produce more for them to buy. But Russia, Trump has also said he's going to move on Russia a lot more aggressively. He's going to use tariffs to do it. Effectively, anybody that does business with Russia is going to be punished big time if Russia doesn't knock it off in Ukraine. Will that work as a cudgel? And the energy exchange and purchasing from Europe to Russia, can we impact it that way too? And I've got about a minute, if you please.
Well, there's about a win-win here for the Europeans because they need to wean themselves off Russian gas. That's clear, and there's plenty of U.S. energy that needs to be produced, and the European energy policies have been such that they've escalated their own energy costs as well. So there's a win-win there. I think you're also seeing the use of American power to broker deals with countries where they are in conflict. You saw this with Cambodia and Thailand. You saw it with Pakistan and India. So I think we're seeing a lot more activity from the US on, really trying to force parties to, come to agreements. Whereas in the past, we've sort of sat there and let them, let them fester.
Yeah, and what it means financially, it will be fascinating to see if, a year from this conversation, what the economy looks like. And China, by the way, on deck. And this levels more pressure against China, I assume, too, to get a deal.
We could have an announcement as early as today.
With China?
I think it'll be a deal that will extend the days, so they won't go to the higher tariff that they're negotiating in Sweden right now. But the goal here is to get China to do even more of what the EU and the UK and Japan and Indonesia and others have done.
Thank you, Shanker Singham.